Vue released a new feature named the Composition API, which allows developers to code in different ways. It also allows them more flexibility, as well as it allows them to create reusable code as well as reusable functionalities. Excited? We're going to talk about all of these right in this video. Let's go! So, Composition API is a new feature released by the Vue development team which addresses the problem of enterprise applications, namely the grouping of code, the arrangement of components, as well as the handling of huge components. So, Composition API allows the fragmentation of code, meaning you can extract functionalities into a separate file as well as reuse them in different components. So, in an enterprise perspective or in large-scale applications, that is a very useful feature. So, in this video, we're going to talk about more of those, or rather, we're going to talk about the Composition API, the Options API, as well as the Composables, and we're going to differentiate between the three by using examples and by showing them at the same time. So we're going to compare them side by side in order to see the difference. So here, as you can see, we have a Vue.js app already up, or rather it's already set up and ready to go, right? So we have a to-do list options, we have to-do list composition, as well as to-do list composables. So here you can see we have three components. So we set up this one, and this one. So we have three components in total. So first, we're going to demonstrate the Options API. So what the Options API can do and how we create how we can create a simple, a simple application using the Options API. In this case, we're going to use the to-do lists example. So also, aside from that, we're going to also create the same application, but this time using the Composition API. So we're going to utilize the Composition API to recreate the same application, but in this case, we're going to use the syntax of the Composition API to create the application. And last but not least, we're going to improve upon that composition using composables, which is this one. So we're going to use this file in order to create a composable within the composition application that we're going to create. So we're going to dive into all of those three right now. So first, let's start off with the options. So by default, the Options API is the most beginner-friendly type of out of all the three. Or we're going to talk about more regarding that type of scenario. So first, let's create the template in order to demonstrate or in order to set up our basic to-do list. So first, we're going to create a div which will hold the application itself, and then we're going to set up first the input. So we're going to create an input. Let's set it to text, and then let's add a v model. Let's say to-do list input to make things more simple. And then after we create this, we're going to have an input, right? So we're going to need now a data in order to bind the element to the model. So we're going to need a data, and then we're going to, we're going to add this return statement. So we're going to return a variable. In this case, let's say a string. So let's say to-do list input. For now, let's set it to null. What it means is that if we add an input or if we type something here, it's going to contain the value for the model. Meaning if I type, for example, text here, the value of the to-do list input is text as well. So aside from that, we need to display a list of items that will contain our to-do list, right? So we're going to add another variable here, which is to-do list basically. And then let's set it to an array, meaning it's an array of strings, right? So now that we have our container, let's display this content. So let's create a basic unordered list, and then let's create a li, and then let's use the v for in order to iterate the array, and then let's set this one to, let's say, item, then index in to-do list And then let's use the key of index. Oh, wrong. Let's just close. Okay, and then let's display let's add a span. And then let's add the item itself. So there you go. What it means is that the v-for initiative loops the array itself, right? So if I add an item to the array, it's going to display it in the DOM as well. So now that we have that one, we have an input, we need a way to bind our input to the array. So we're going to create a method. So again, let's create a method right here. So let's say add to-do list. Now just to make things simple. And then let's set this one to, let's say, input, meaning it's a function, and the input that we pass here is going to be set inside here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to reference the do list, and then we're going to push the input. So like that. And then we're going to add an event in our input. Let's add a button instead. So button. At click, what it's going to do is add to-do list. And then we're going to bind the to-do list input. Add. Let's just keep it at that. Something like that. And then let's add a little bit of style, to add a little bit of difference. So let's add some, let's say padding, right? Let's say 20 pixels. Oh, wrong. It's not padding, it's margin. Oh no, margin left. I'm referencing the button. I'm sorry. So there you go. So what it means is that if we type something in the input and if I click the add button, it's supposedly going to add the item that I typed inside the input into the array, right? So let's test it out. So let's say something. Let's say yes. There you go. Meaning, if I click the add button, it's going to update the array, and then the DOM will automatically re-render since the variable is reactive, because data variables are reactive. So now that we have an addition, let's create a way to, or let's add a way to remove items from the list. So aside from the add to-do list, we're going to create a remove to-do list. So remove to-do list. And then we have the index. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove an item from the array based on the index that we passed to it. So we're going to use the same variable, which is to-do list, and then we're going to splice the array. Splice means you're going to remove certain number of elements from an array based on the index. So in this case, we're going to use the index value, and then let's set it to 1. Meaning we're going to remove one item from the array. So next is we're going to add the button right here. And then at click, what it's going to do is it's going to remove the to-do list, and then let's bind the index from the array. And then let's add, let's say X, something like that. So if I add an item here, item 1, it's going to add an X button. So to make things much more presentable in a sense, let's add a little bit of style. So let's add a margin left of around 20 pixels again, something like that. Keep things simple. So if I click the X button, it's supposedly going to remove the item. Like so. Okay, so now we have a basic to-do list application using the options API, right? So if you take a look at this, there's nothing much going on around here, right? It's just a basic implementation of the application, which is the to-do list, in the options API sense. So let's move now to compositions. So in terms of compositions, there's a big difference in terms of coding style. First and foremost, if we jump to the composition area right here, you will notice a big difference. In the options API, you will see that we have a data, right? We have these certain, certain areas of the code, like data, methods. You also have mounted. You also have other types of mounts, or rather mounts, what do you call this? Other types of values, for example, before mounted, before created, and others. So, in a sense, the application itself has a basic sense of structure, right? But in terms of structure sense, in composition, that part of the code, the structure itself, is dependent on the user. Meaning, as you as a developer, you have the capability to structure your code the way you want it to. So, to demonstrate, we're going to show you how a application is created using the composition API. So, let's duplicate the exact same application, but this time we're going to use composition API. So let's just grab this element right here, to make things simpler. So we have a duplicate, right? So let's keep the variables the same in order to retain the structure. So the big difference here, or the key difference rather here, is first and foremost, there is no more data section. So since there is no more data section, how do you create variables, right? How do you create JavaScript variables? So in composition API, we create variables using the keyword ref, meaning we're going to create a reference to a JavaScript variable. For example, let's say to do list input, we're going to add a ref to it. And then, since we're going to have a ref, the first thing we're going to do is import the ref from the view itself, meaning looks something like this. Import the ref function from view. And as you can see, it's going to resolve perfectly. And the next, now that we have a ref here, we're going to declare a initial value for the variable. So we're going to set this one to null. Meaning, we have now a variable named to-do-list input, which is a referenced value which contains a null value. Now, you may ask, what is the ref used for? In JavaScript, values rather are, since they are passed by value, what happens is if you create another value, let's say you created a, what do you call this? Let's create a variable. Let's say to-do list input 2 is equals to to-do list input. What it means is it's pointing towards this first variable. That is how JavaScript basically works by default. Instead of, the typical behavior is if we create another variable and then we assign another variable to it, it's going to create a copy, right? The thing is, in JavaScript, it doesn't work that way. What it means is that it's going to point you to the original variable. If you change it somewhere or one way or another, everything is affected. Hence, the reason why view variables are reactive in the first place. Because no matter how deep you go in the code, in one way or another, the ref function ensures that the variable is reachable in any way at all, regardless of how deep your code is. So that's what it does, basically. Next, since now we have a reference value, next, how does the template rather use the variable now? So, as you can see, it's highlighted red. So we created a variable and did not use it at all. So as you can see, it's right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to return. Now, this return value here is rather a very kind of a weird sense. What it means is that anything you return in the setup function is usable in the template in any way. For example, let's return the created variable, which is the to-do list input. So as you can see, the to-do list input resolved nicely. So we now have a input right here. So you can see I can type properly. Also, there's another thing with setups. The thing is with setups, which is the composition API variant, which is this one, you can return functions. For example, in options API, we have methods, right? Here, as you can see, we have methods. So how do you create methods in composition API? Herein lies the key difference rather. Because in composition API, you can dictate how you will structure your code in a sense that you can structure it the way you want to. For example, you can group together certain variables, you can group together certain functions, you can group together certain parts of code. making it more, they call this, flexible in terms of arrangement. In the options API, that is not the case. For example, you created a method here, and it, what do you call this? And it uses a certain variable. You're going to have to check the data section in order to figure out which variable you're actually looking at, right? So in the case of composition, that is not the case anymore because you can simply group them together. So to demonstrate, we have a add to-do list, right? So we're going to duplicate that exact functionality. So how do you create functions inside the composition API? One way to create a function is by using the let. So we're going to create a function, let add to-do list equals a function. So as you can see, we assigned a function to a variable, and then we're going to set the parameters. In this case, we're going to set input. And now we have a function. So we're going to duplicate the exact functionality as before. So in this case, you will see the word this, right? In composition API, we never use the word this because this, in the sense of setup, is a different type of value. It does not point to the application itself, or rather the template or the view component the way you expect it to in options API. The reason why is because in composition API, the setup function runs or processes this entire function before the actual DOM is rendered. There's a key difference for that. Meaning, your functions, your functionalities, and your code behaviors is already initialized by the time the DOM starts to render. So there's a huge difference, right? So that means if you use the word this on a component that is not rendered yet in the first place, you're going to have a bad time. Therefore, we do not use the value this inside the composition API. So in this case, how do you use the variables, right? For example, the to-do list input. So since we created a to-do list input and we binded a reference to it, we're going to use the to-do list input that value. What it means is that, something like that. So if you take a look at to-do list input, if you binded a reference to it, you're going to have two objects. First is the actual function, and second is the actual value, which is this one. So in this case, we're not going to use the value. We're simply going to use we're going to create a container, right? So let's add let's add the container as well. So let to-do list equals, again, reference. So let's create a reference, and then this time we're going to add an empty array. There you go. So we now have two variables, right? And then we're going to return that same variable in order for the DOM to be able to use it. So to-do list. Again, anything you return in the setup function is usable by the template. So now that I return the to-do list here, it is now usable in the template. So as you can see, the to-do list variable here has already resolved. Next, we're going to add the functionality. So we're going to refer to the to-do list that value, meaning the array, and then we're going to push. That's how composition API works, especially the references. So now that we have the function here, we're going to export the add to-do list. So as you can see, we now have a to-do list input, we now have a to-do list, which is an array, and then we have an add to-do list, which is a function. So as you can see, we now have a basic functionality, or rather the addition functionality. So if I add something here, it's supposedly going to display the item. So let's say test. There you go. Meaning, with composition API, you can structure your code in a much more relaxed manner instead of being forced to scroll up and down to create specific values and to locate certain values. In the composition sense, it allows you to basically structure the code the way you want it to. So that is how composition API works best. Also, that is the reason why the composition API was created in the first place. Later on, we're going to talk a bit about the composables, which is an integral part in enterprise applications. So later, we're going to talk about it and we're going to demonstrate as well. So for now, let's just stick here with the composition API. So now that we have an add to-do list, we now need a remove to-do list. So let's recreate that same functionality, again using the same principle. So let's create a remove to-do list, and then we're going to create a function again, same as before, and then we're going to use the to-do list, the value, meaning the array, and then we're going to splice it again. So in this case, we're going to have the index as the parameter of the function. So let's pass the index here, and then let's remove one item. And lastly, we're going to return this function right here in order for the component or the template itself to use the function. So as you can see, we're now back to the same functionality, but in this case, we now use the composition API. So if I add an item here, let's say the test, if I click the X button, it's supposed to remove the item. So as you can see, we now have the same functionality, right? Basically, same functionality, different ways of coding. So now that we have that up and running, we can now somewhat compare the two. So as you can see in the options, we have methods right here, right? So in the methods, basically all your functions are located mostly in the methods area. In the case of composition, you can restructure them and you can, or rather, you can place them anywhere you like in the setup function. But definitely, if you're going to use variables inside your function, first you need to declare them in the upper section area. What do you mean by that? For example, I move it up here. Oh, it still works. Okay, so okay, so basically it still works. But it's working because the function itself is not yet running. It is a good practice rather to first initialize the variables you will need to use in your functions, right? So in this case, we can also implement that type of behavior. So first, we're going to create our variables right here in the top section. And then next, we're going to create our functions, which is this one right here. So as you can see, we group together certain values. So you might ask, how do we differentiate methods from data, from mounted, or from anything else, right? So the thing is, the way we differentiate between those things is based on functionality. There are certain functions that can be grouped together. For example, this one. We can group this function and let's say add to-do list function, add item to list, for example. And then let's say this one is remove item from list. And then we can add another documentation here of some sort. Let's say to-do list functions. Something like this. So like that. And then let's add another documentation here, and then let's just close this one down. So as you can see, this is the beauty of the composition API, because since now we are able to group together functions regardless of whether they are methods, watchers, or data, we can now group certain functionalities together to avoid that constant scrolling up and down when the application gets big enough. That is the case that happened here in our company, wherein our components are getting really humongous, or rather, they are getting so bloated that whenever you debug a certain method, you'd have to scroll all the way upwards in order to check the variable that you are going to check. For those who are using Visual Studio Code, you can just simply control-click, right? But sometimes it causes confusion as well because data variables are interconnected and you don't know where that variable is used at all, or not unless you have the, let's say, certain ID functionalities that allows you to check those types of things. But again, we're back to the same problem wherein the data is disjointed from the watcher and from the methods. Whereas in the case of composition, you can group them together. So there's no more confusion between which is which. So for example, let's group these functionalities together. That is possible. So like to-do list, functionality. So as you can see, we have grouped together this functionality. So we have two variables, we have two functions, and their functionality is the to-do list functionality. So let's say I want to add another functionality within this component, we can add another certain block here, and then let's say functionality 2. So something like this. And then let's say something like that. And then let's say add stuff here. And then let's add another documentation here. So something like that. So as you can see, you can now group certain functionalities and pieces of code together, making the code more concise as well as more organized. Unlike the options variant, wherein your methods are basically dismantled or disjointed from its variables, which is in the data section in the upper area, which is right here. So for example, in this case, you have two methods and then they are using these two variables. So if the application gets big enough, let's say there's 10 variables here, and then you have 20 modules or let's say 20 methods, how do you group those things together, right? So you can't group the data and the methods together in a single block of code rather. Whereas in composition, you can group them together and you can also add documentations like this. So it makes the code more precise, more organized, and more easier to maintain, which is a very useful feature for those types of applications that are getting really, really big. So in our case, enterprise applications. So that is one beautiful feature of the Composition API. So now that we have duplicated the same functionality in Composition API, let's now talk about composables. What are composables?